Welcome to an all-new episode of Get Lit with Lianna, the podcast. Join me as I sit down with a new guest author in each episode to discuss their books, careers, and everything in between. Today I'm joined by debut romance author Melissa Barron, who wrote the brand new book, Twice in a Lifetime. I'll be completely honest, I hadn't heard much of this book before I picked it up, but it quickly became one of my favorite books of 2022. I know that says a lot considering how many books I read and how many books I really love, but I feel like this is a story that's very much going to resonate with a lot of audiences, and I know is one that's sticking with me for a very long time. This book is very different than the types of love stories I typically read because it is a little more on the fantasy side with aspects of time travel, but it has an incredible conversation intertwined within it about mental health representation. And it's just overall such an impactful story. Without further ado, my conversation with Melissa Barron starts right now. Welcome, Melissa Barron, to the podcast. I am so excited to have you here. If you don't know me or follow me on Instagram, you may not have noticed that in the last 24 hours, I've just been having like a love fest over your book because it's so good. And it took me by such surprise because, to be totally transparent, I hadn't heard much about your book prior to picking it up. I found it on my own research when I was trying to see like what books I wanted to read in December that weren't necessarily holiday centered, just because that's obviously a lot of what's being published in these months. And I saw your book and I was like, this sounds like an insane concept. Like when I read the plot, and I have to say, and I posted it yesterday when I was reading it, like I was hooked beyond hooked from the first pages, and I couldn't put it down. And I basically read the entirety of the book in 2 sittings. And the only reason why it took me 2 sittings was because I had to eat dinner. Like there just wasn't no other option. But it's such a great book. So welcome. I'm so happy to have you here and that we could talk about the story because I really loved it. And it's one of my favorite books that I've read in 2022. So
thank you so much. My heart.
So before we get into this book and kind of some of the key moments and the inspiration behind it, I'd love to know just a little bit about you because I know this is your first traditionally published book. I'm not sure if that means you haven't written before. Like, I'd love to know a little bit more about your background and your writing history.
Sure. It is both first traditionally published book and published book in general. Not that I have not written other things, but this is the first one that has made it over these hurdles.
Yeah.
I've been pretty consistently writing, since I was like 12, 13. I completed my first book when I was 14 that will never see the light of day, like ever. It was actually a thriller. I don't remember a whole lot. I know, right? I don't remember a whole lot about it now, but the thing that felt important to younger me was that I finished it. And so I like held on to that as I got into my teens and in my 20s. And I still did some writing. I wrote like fanfic and just things that kind of fantasy, romance, things that I was just experimenting with what I really enjoyed. And I had a hard time finishing anything, but I knew I had done it before. So it was only a matter of time. And then the idea for Twice in a Lifetime came out of an actual text message exchange I had with a stranger in the spring of 2018. I got this screenshot from an unknown number and, this little note, and I was like, oh, wrong number. And he was very insistent that we knew each other. And I was like, who are you? And he goes, it's me. And I was like, who's me? And he goes, your husband. And I was like, no. I was very single at the time. We found out that he was trying to get a hold of his wife from a friend's phone transposed to the numbers by accident. Because I don't know like anybody's phone numbers anymore because everything's programmed into our phones.
Totally.
So it's completely fair that happened to him. We laughed it off, but then like that stuck that who is it? I'm your husband kind of thing. And then the wedding plot bunny took off, and I spent the rest of the year writing it.
Crazy. So this was like in 2018 when you wrote it. So how did like the pandemic and COVID like impact the story, or did it impact the story, I guess, in any way?
It was pretty fully it mostly impacted the querying process.
Okay.
The story itself was done. I finished the first draft in October of 2018, and I was in revision mode um, up through like the beginning of the pandemic. Um, I think the thing that like what affected some of the revisions the most was I mean, like during the query process with agents, you typically don't get a lot of feedback. They see so
Mm.
many submissions. It's really hard for them to give personalized feedback. Totally understand. I had one full request that ended in a rejection,
Oh
but
God.
she was, oh, that was rough. Like, it was the gut
Yeah.
of me.
I
It was like,
actually can't imagine.
it was peak pandemic at the time. So I was just like, my God.
Not now, not in this climate.
All right.
Yeah.
But she was kind enough to give me some feedback that I could actually use. She thought the beginning was slow. So I initially didn't have it start with a text message. It kind of just, you kind of get to know Isla a little bit. It was a bit of a slow start, and she had a hard time with that. And so I thought, you know what? We're going to start right out the gate. We're just going to go right into it. And that's what worked. So
And
yeah, I
that's what
think
hooked me as a reader. And I'm sure it's what's going to hook
good.
everyone else that's reading it because it's like the most crazy concept ever.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
It was that I think that's what when the agent I ended up with, granted she's I'm with the same agency, but I'm no longer with her. She left agenting earlier this year. Her name is Devin Halliday. She was
Okay.
fabulous. She was just wonderful to work with, and really helped the story shine and helped keep all of the cliffhangers, all of the timeline stuff, sort of to make sure that the logistics worked
Right.
out, so you
Right.
can get lost in the story and not get hung up on something that doesn't make sense, kind of thing. One thing I do think maybe the pandemic affected a little bit was I was worried because it is a heavier book, and I'm pitching it, and it's on submission in the pandemic. Is it going to be too heavy? And is
Right.
it really people are going to be like, no, I just want something light, and I get it. That was also a lot of my reading at the time. So there was that added insecurity
Right.
going into this climate with this type of book.
Right. And then obviously you ended up snagging a book deal, which is crazy. And like, I feel, especially at that time, kind of was like a needle in a haystack sort of situation. Was that very exciting for you, like being a writer and wanting to write the story and written, like having had written other stories as a child? Like, what was that kind of reaction when you got that call? Like, okay, yeah, we want it.
It it felt like an out of body experience
Yeah.
at that point, because we had been on submission for almost 9 months, and I was starting to get worried the longer that goes on. And it was a lot of like really positive, lovely feedback, but ultimately, a variety of reasons why it just was not, either they had something too similar, it just didn't quite fit, what they
Mhm.
typically took on, and I was prepared for more of that. And then the editor that reached out from Alcohol, her name is also Melissa.
Oh, funny.
um, and right, and before we said yes, we had a conversation with her because I wanted to hear what she thought of the book. One of the things I was a little concerned about, even though the novel takes on some heavier subjects, it was not things I wanted to shy away from.
Mhm.
And I worried that some of the edits that she would want would sort of undo a little bit of that, but she had the same vision for it. She was
Amazing.
like all in. And that was what I needed to hear, really, that she
Yeah.
understood what I was trying to do with this book.
Yeah. Okay. So I would love to just get into this story now because obviously I want to talk about some of those more heavy subjects that the book touches upon so delicately and so well. But before we go any further, I'm hoping you can maybe, like, for the people that are listening, give a little summary of what exactly Twice in a Lifetime is about. And feel free, because this episode, I love to do all my episodes like this. We're going to talk about everything. So feel free to add in any spoilers that you think are
Okay.
necessary for the story. You don't feel like you need to like hold back.
Okay, sounds great. So the novel primarily follows a graphic designer and artist named Isla Abbott. She's originally from Chicago. She flees Chicago, buys a cute little cottage right outside of St. Louis, so she gets a little bit of that rural, quiet, sort of decompressed uh, surroundings to help her deal with the events that have happened in her life. Her mother recently passed away, and that started a cascade of a resurgence of an anxiety disorder that she has, which comes with panic attacks, and a depressive episode. She's alone, and a part of her wants to be alone, but this is her method of coping right now.
Mm-hmm.
And she receives a text message just pretty much within the week she moves in from a man essentially claiming to be her husband, which she thinks is hilarious. Except he sends her proof. He sends her a photo of them on their wedding day. And so we start this whole out of time, different timeline conversations between Isla and the husband she hasn't met yet.
Mm-hmm.
And he is essentially trying to prevent something in her future that has disastrous consequences for Isla that eventually will cost her her life because she's no longer around in his timeline. But in order for her to make the changes that would require undoing these events, it might jeopardize them even meeting in the first place. So there's a lot of unknowns Isla gets thrown into, a lot of growing she's asked to do and has to undergo in order to go on this journey.
So the concept, obviously, you just mentioned earlier in this conversation came to you from in a very organic way where you got a text message, a missed connection text message, however you want to call it. But then the idea of you adding to that with the whole time travel of it all, like as a reader, first and foremost, I guess, is that type of fiction something that like very much interests you, like that type of fantasy? Because I can't imagine it being easy to write something like that without being kind of a fan of reading stories like that. Or am I completely off pace?
I am a fan. I wouldn't call myself like it's not a particular trope that I consume a lot of media about.
Okay.
I've definitely read I enjoyed Outlander, read The King's Daughter's Wife. I think I was more interested though in what the dynamic would be like with one love interest that knows the other very well and the other knows nothing about them.
Right.
And what sort of conversations do they have? What does that look like? And the sort of the unknowns and the curiosity and the yearning in there for, from the other side, being able to get in touch with the one that they thought they lost. I think I was more interested in how that would play out. And then I was going to work out the details later.
Right. Because I imagine writing a story like this, it maybe was like confusing for you to write, having kind of these two characters in different timelines. Like as a reader, it was very seamless, like a seamless reading experience. Like I was able to follow and totally understand. I was just super curious as to like, well, when does the time run out? Like at what point the timelines kind of have to intersect that this can no longer happen? And once we got to that point, which is obviously the day of the accident, and kind of everything falls into place, and Isla's now put in the position of trying to have to like re-find Ewan and like try to find him in her current timeline. I was like, this is a very interesting tactic because now it talks about a bigger conversation of like rewriting history and things that are meant to be that will be, and changing one factor, like the butterfly effect, like it's just a very interesting bigger concept. And I'm curious about like when you were writing the book, how much of that were you think? I mean, obviously you have to be a big part, but how much of that notion of like one change and the effects of each of those changes came into play when you were writing the story?
I was pretty aware of that, especially as it related to that first accident. And I'm glad you brought up the butterfly effect. That's a movie I actually really loved, and I
love it too.
Had the back of my head when we make decisions like that, when we undo something, it is going to have consequences. And they meant because of it. And with that being undone, it stood to reason that it would rewrite the whole thing. She'd be back at square one. And then I guess I didn't, maybe logistically it kind of made sense anyways, that she would just lose connection with the Ewan that she knew because that meeting is gone. And part of that played really well into the growth that Isla needed to go through.
Mhm.
Because as much as this is a love story between Isla and Ewan, it's also the story of Isla
Mhm.
um, accepting and loving herself more.
Mhm.
And that was a big one where she would have to, it would ultimately be up to her at that point. And what does that look like for someone who's taking these baby steps into better mental health, better coping skills for
Yeah.
herself?
Yeah.
And then with the undoing the accident, and I wanted to add the other layer of maybe this is a timeline that really doesn't like it when you meddle with it. And some things are just going to happen, whether you like it
Mhm.
or not. And it is ultimately what you do with that
Yeah.
that is the real lesson that Isla has to learn.
Yeah. I loved Isla as a main character because of how layered she was, in the sense that she was combating so much in her personal life, but kind of was not outwardly showing it. And
Mhm.
I love the conversation that kind of is stimulated within this book about mental health and the representation and suicide, and how it's very authentic, but still very gently told. And it's not very like jarring. I found it wasn't very, as a reader at least, traumatic. It was more like in a healing kind of way, and like in an understanding and in like a taking care of yourself kind of way. How was that as a writer to kind of build that into your main character and kind of make that the focal point of this character in this story?
Well, thank you for saying that. That was a big concern I had, because it is a fine line
Mhm.
when you're touching on such a heavy subject, and it is a very triggery subject.
Mhm.
I put it a lot of my past struggles into Isla, including pretty much all of it,
Mhm.
and a lot of the conversations that she has with herself and with Ewan were the way I had conceptualized my struggles with suicidal ideation and
Mhm.
depression. And I wanted to do exactly what you got out of it.
Mhm.
I wanted it to be more of a healing thing and not bringing it up in a traumatic way.
Yes.
That because it would negate what I was trying to do. That the whole process of writing that novel and writing it from Isla's perspective and having her go on the journey that I did throughout my 20s
Mhm.
um, was incredibly therapeutic for me. It was hard. There were some scenes that I had to walk away from
Mhm.
that kind of put me in a funk for a couple of days, that because I had to climb right back in that
For
headspace.
sure. For sure.
But at the end of it, you know, the ultimate message was a hopeful one. And if it was therapeutic for me, I had hoped that other people would not feel as alone, would get
Right.
the same experience out of it.
Right.
So I was very cognizant of that. I read the whole thing out loud to myself. I wanted to hear how
Wow.
it sounded. I had friends who have also been in the same headspaces read it,
Mhm.
because I know my lived experience is not indicative of everyone's lived
Right.
experience. I tried to if I was going to go down that road, I wanted to be as thoughtful about it as possible,
Mhm.
because I didn't want to alienate anyone.
Yeah.
I knew going in that, and I'm really glad that my editor was on board too. That there was no sense, she didn't really tell me, "Oh, this is too much. You need to pull back," kind of thing.
Right.
I kind of took my cues from my early readers if it felt way too heavy, and I would make some like word changes and here and
Okay.
there, but ultimately kept the spirit of it all the way through.
Mhm. And even just beyond the mental health rep, then having the whole like overcoming a disability part of the book with the TBI. Like, I personally have not read many books that are so like informative, but also like very honest depictions of disability, especially a disability that is like not born, like a traumatic event
Yeah.
that causes the disability. How come you chose to use TBI as something that ultimately like really was very debilitating for Isla and had such an impact on her life, as opposed to a different type of injury or a different type of repercussion from the accident?
TBI is it has similarities in the way that certain mental illnesses do, where they're invisible.
Hmm.
Um, and not many people see that, and they don't really understand. I have family members that have had TBIs and um, other brain issues where
Mhm.
they had to brain fog was a huge thing, and it had a massive effect on their lives. And they had to relearn
Mhm.
sort of what their life would be
Navigate.
like
Yeah,
once
like how to
they,
navigate their life. Yeah.
yeah, we watched it happen. And I guess, yeah, they just, to me, the way that people outwardly kind of view both tend to be kind of the same. That either they might
Mhm.
not, and you know, one of the things about Isla that was true for me, and I think is true for some other people who have depression or anxiety, we are very good at hiding it,
Mhm.
or trying to be as high functioning as possible, because the day-to-day world doesn't always have a lot of patience for that. And I've seen that it is the same for some people who have TBIs to varying degrees. And I wanted to, even though I've sort of been around it before. I have a very good friend who is a doctor, and I had him read it too. I'm like, are we? And he's like, they
Yeah.
present very differently. It is unique to each individual
Mhm.
how it presents. So it almost, for Isla, it was something that might actually feel a little familiar to her.
Right.
The memory issues, brain
Mhm.
fog, are
Similar
also things.
symptoms.
Yeah,
Yeah.
varying
Okay.
degrees. I know
That's
they are very different as far as
mhm.
their causes,
Mhm.
but I think they share certain symptoms for
Mhm.
sure.
It's so interesting to just change it up a little bit and get a little bit on the lighter side of the story. And then I would love to talk about like the ending and how they kind of end this time travel situation. But like Ewan as a character is pretty flawless in my opinion. Like the one critique, not even a critique, but the one thing about him that like I was like, is like he just doesn't ever present himself in like a negative light. Like he just seems so supportive and like such an ooey-gooey sweet guy and so caring and like devoted to Isla. Was that so fun for you to write? Just like having that little like reprieve, I guess, from all the other heaviness in this book. Was he kind of like a bright spot for you?
He was very
Mhm.
soothing. And just it was, I don't know, from, for both me and for Isla, just
Mhm.
to and I will say, when they had their text message exchanges
Mhm.
before you meet the real Ewan, he does have the gift of hindsight, so it is easier for him to know what to say
Yeah.
in that regard. So he almost does also fill a sort of therapist like role for her initially,
Mhm.
and it's very easy for her to fall in love with that. The real Ewan um, doesn't always nail it in the same way, but he tries really
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
Um, and there is a moment where he wavers a little, where you can see that the other side of when you're in a relationship with someone who is struggling with anxiety and panic attacks, and has deep insecurities, and what that may be like from his end.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, ultimately, I really enjoyed his point of view, and I did that on purpose. Originally, I wasn't going to have his point of view at all. It was just going to be all Isla.
Oh,
And then when I brought him in, I knew immediately that that was a good decision. It is a little bit of a reprieve,
yeah,
and a little bit of a juxtaposition of the way Isla views herself versus the way other people
totally.
view Isla.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for a lot of us too. We are our own worst critics. We're so hard on ourselves. And when you are on the outside and you're someone that cares about
Hmm.
you looking in, they don't see that. They don't see any of what you're seeing. And it's
It's,
a, yeah.
yeah. I know it's so true. It's so, so true. I loved that we had that other perspective too, and especially his perspective, because I feel like he just really looks at her and like sees the best in her and wants the best for her. And it was just like a very comforting alternative to what was actually going on in her head, knowing what you know about her and knowing her
Yeah.
story arc. We have to talk about the ending and how all of these like timelines converge. I'm not going to lie. When I was reading it, I was like, how is this going to happen? Like, how is this going to end? Like, I refuse to believe that this book is going to end in a world where like they are not together and Ewan is dead and this is the end.
Oh, yeah. I would never do that.
I knew that you couldn't leave us in that position. So I was like, how is she going to communicate with a past self or a self in another timeline where she can like right this wrong in a way that needs to be done? And what I loved about the way that timeline went was what was meant to happen still happened. And she just did the work and overcame herself, essentially, which is something she wasn't able to do in the timeline when they first met. So I would love to just talk firstly about like how you decided to, or how you even came up with the idea of how Isla was going to connect with Isla, like that with the different timelines. Like, tell me about that idea and how fun it was to write. If it was confusing for you to write, like I would love to know about that.
I had to write out many different versions to find the one that kind of felt the most satisfying and was ultimately the simplest to sort of like write through. Because I started, without going too spoilery, I started with, the classic like fixed timeline. There is a fixed like 3-year difference. Initially, there would be a fixed 3-year difference. That meant that Isla would have to wait the whole 3 years for the previous timeline to match up to the event she needed to get in touch with herself. I wrote that out. That ending exists.
Oh my God.
And I tested it on my friends and they were like, why are you doing this to her? And I was like, but it's a fixed timeline. It's the only way I can make it work. So I abandoned that. And I was like, how do I have my cake and eat it too? How do I get that conversation? Because I really was dedicated to Isla reaching out to herself and having that self-soothing sort of conversation to get her to choose the path that's best for everyone, especially herself. And it had to be linked to those accidents. And so I made it more fluid. And within my rules, someone had to be in that house. The house is where the connection lives. And I also didn't want to muddy it with too much. I didn't want her to have too much time to introduce, because she lost her mother recently. It would have been one of those things like, would she try and undo that too? I didn't want to muddy the waters too much. I wanted to keep it tight. So she does have to wait. It's a more manageable wait. And I kind of wanted to show that even with what happens, Isla, the work that she's done, that Ewan kind of helped get her started on that path, has already started to pay off in a way.
Right.
She is grieving, but it is a what's the word? It is healthy, I guess,
like cathartic almost.
Yeah, and she has not allowed it to put her life to a screeching halt the way she would have. The way it would have just consumed her before.
Right.
And I use that little chunk of time to kind of show that before you get to the end, when she's able, when the timelines kind of match up to where she needs it to, and then she's able to make that call. So it was, there are also, in addition to that other ending, there are like 2 other endings that we experimented with, because over Ewan, really. So I've got a lot of cut material of just figuring out, because I need to know. Yeah. I just needed to let it all play out and see what would happen. And the ending that made it into the book was the most satisfying for me, everyone involved. So that's what we went with.
It's so good. It's so well written. It's such a great story. It's one of those stories that like I feel is going to stick with me for a while. It's just one of those, like, I put it down, I finished it, and I was like, that's like a really good story. Never mind the romantic elements of it. I love a good love story. Like, it's just a very good story. It just makes you feel good. It made me feel strong. Like, it just was a good story, and I really need more people to read it and talk about it. So I'm so happy you took the time to chat with me today so
Oh,
that
thank
we
you for
can
inviting me.
amplify this story, because it's such a special, it's just, and I feel like it's going to resonate with so many people for so many different reasons. There's something for everybody in this story. So I'm
Mhm.
really, really happy we got to chat.
Thank you. Yeah, this
Pleasure.
was, thank you so much. It was a true pleasure to write, and this book was really special to me. I'm so happy that Alco Press took a chance on it, on me. I'm excited for to keep breaking hearts and
Please.
mending them.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I'm very excited for whatever you have working coming out next. Like I'm a big fan of your writing style. So you'll be
Thank
hearing from me
you.
again. You'll be hearing from me again for sure.